Malachy found him alone in the square. He always found him eventually. This was, in its way, the core of his purpose. To know where Cantor was, what Cantor had taken, and what Cantor was owed. And to present himself at the appropriate moment. He had been doing this for longer than most of the Golden Legion had been alive, and he had perfected the approach over those long years to something very close to an art form. Not too eager, which would have irked him and Cantor both, as it suggested supplication. Not too slow, which would have been worse, as it suggested indifference. The precise, measured arrival of a man who had somewhere else to be but had chosen, as a matter of considered priority, to be here instead, because Cantor was here. Malachy understood the central element of Cantor better than anyone. He was, and always would be, a performer. When the curtains came down, he needed to know that his performance had been witnessed. He crossed the ruined square, his robes whispering across the broken flagstones, the golden trinkets and medallions at his waist catching the morning light and scattering it, in small indifferent constellations, across the blood-darkened cobbles. Behind him, the wooden frames rose from his shoulders in the shape of wings, the carved and lacquered struts dark against the pale smoke and still drifted from the burning trees at the far end of the square. From those frames hung the records of the Golden Legion, page after page of dense script in dried blood, each one the account of a debt owed, a weakness catalogued, a sin committed, and carefully noted for future reference. They rustled softly as he walked, a dry and papery sound, like the rubbing of dry feathers that were never meant for wings. Cantor stood where Walpurgis had stood, at the edge of the square where the ground dropped away toward the harbour. The war pig was gone, returned to the shore, and the silence he left behind had a strange quality, the peculiar quiet of a world that was somehow learning to breathe, now that the presence of something entirely other had been removed. Malachy, Cantor, and Walpurgis had all started their lives as men, and as far gone as Malachy and Cantor were, it was only Walpurgis who seemed to wish to destroy himself utterly. The monk in the golden cage stood a few paces behind his master, as it always did since becoming what it was now, and Malachy allowed himself a brief, private assessment of it as he drew close. The craftsmanship was impeccable. Cantor's work always was. Whatever else one thought of him, and Malachy thought a great many things of him that he kept fastidiously unrecorded, there was no question that his gifts were extraordinary. Even as a monster, Cantor understood beauty. It somehow made Malachy both respect and dislike him even more. "My lord," Malachy said, and tilted his hooded head in a gesture that communicated, with expert precision, exactly as much deference as the situation demanded, and not a fraction more. The masked face swung toward him. Even after all these years, there was something in the eyeless regard of that mask that made the oldest part of Malachy's mind want to step backwards, though he had long since disciplined himself not to obey that instinct. "Malachy," Cantor's voice was even, giving nothing. "The tally. The harbour is secured, as you know. 3 enemy vessels remain partially intact and will be salvageable. The rest are sunk or burning." Malachy reached behind him without looking and drew forward one of the hanging records with the practiced ease of a man he knew every page by touch. His eyes moved across it briefly, though in truth he had no need to consult the page. He never did. The pages were for others, evidence of the work done. The physical proof that the knowledge existed, was held, and most importantly, was his. 12 of our own vessels sustained damage in the engagement. Of those, 4 will require significant repairs before they are seaworthy, and 1 was sunk due to the men's slowness in releasing Walpurgis. The cost will be considerable, and I have already begun the process of distributing the burden of it among those crews whose conduct contributed to the losses. Cantor said nothing, which was neither approval nor objection, and which Malachy had learned long ago to read as permission to continue. The garrison is destroyed. Their command structure is gone. There are survivors, naturally. There are always survivors. He allowed the faintest shade of distaste to cross his withered face. They are being processed. Those with debts outstanding to the Legion will be catalogued and put to use. The remainder are of no interest. And the town? Cantor asked it almost indifferently, but there was something there under his voice, a trembling hunger that caught Malachy by surprise. Malachy glanced across the ruined square, at the heaved flagstones, the shattered fountain, the empty window frames staring out from battered walls like the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Damaged substantially but standing. Basilica is intact, structurally. Walpurgis showed a certain restraint relative to his usual standard. Yes, upon occasion, he can surprise even me, said Cantor. Malachy did not like Walpurgis, but he respected the economy of understanding him. The war pig was, in his way, a simple entry in a very complex ledger. The grief was the debt, the destruction, the interest, and through the intersection of both, the ferrying of souls to Mammon's vault. The account would never be settled. These were the terms, and they would never change. My lord, he said, returning the page to its place among the wings with a soft, dry rattle. Our position here is secure. The question now becomes how long we intend to hold it. We don't, Cantor said. Malachy had expected this, but allowed a beat of apparent consideration before responding. The men will need resupply, the damaged ships will be dealt with. We leave sufficient force here to blockade the harbour and deny its use to any relief column. The rest move inland. Cantor turned the masked face back towards the harbour, where the deep black ships sat at anchor in the bloodied water, their crimson sails furled, their gold and silver panels throwing back the morning light in slow, sickly pulses. Within the week. Malachy was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully measured, the voice of a man raising a practical concern and nothing more. Inland, he said. Into the forest. Yes. The terrain will be difficult for a force of our size. Supply lines could be exposed. If the garrison here had time to send word before we took the harbour, they did not, Cantor replied. My lord, we cannot be certain of that. They did not. Cantor's voice did not rise, but it acquired a quality that Malachy recognized and respected, in the way that one respected the edge of a blade. Not with admiration, but with a clear understanding of what it was capable of. The watchfires were still burning when we made landfall. They had no warning and no time. No word was sent. Malachy accepted this with another small inclination of his hooded head. The sigil on the front of it caught the light briefly as he moved, a dark and complex shape that seemed, in certain lights, to be looking back at whoever looked at it. Then the forest, he said, as though concluding a calculation, and the fortress. Cantor said nothing, which this time Malachy read differently. Not permission, but confirmation. He let the silence sit for a moment and observed with the careful and unobtrusive attention that was perhaps his most finely developed skill, the quality of stillness that had come over his master at the mention of the fortress. It was a minute thing, a distant echo within the stillness, but Malachy had spent centuries cataloguing the subtle behavioural indicators of hidden investment, and he recognised it with the quiet, internal satisfaction of a collector identifying a rare piece. There was something here, something beyond strategy, beyond the cold logic of neutralising a threat before pushing further into enemy territory. Biarritz was the first target, yes, and the necessity of its destruction was plain enough. You did not leave a fortified harbour at your back while marching inland. Any commander with a basic grasp of the principles of engagement understood this. But understanding the necessity of a thing was not the same as wanting it, with the particular quality of want that Malachy could feel radiating from Cantor now, subtle as heat from stone that has been in the sun all day. He wanted this. Not the campaign, not the fortress, this town, this harbour, this particular army of this particular order of monks and soldiers. Malachy now knew this, but he did not know why. This bothered him in a way he could not have permitted anyone to know, and would not have recorded in any ledger, because to record a gap in one's knowledge was to document failure. Malachy did not document his failures, only those of others. That was the arrangement, and he kept to it rigorously. But the absence of knowledge about Cantor's relationship to this place, to the Brotherhood of the Blackened Crown, to the specific fervour that had driven this campaign from its earliest planning, sat in his soul like a splinter, small, invisible, and persistently irritating. He had long since given up the hope of finding it written down anywhere. Cantor was old and careful, and whatever history he carried it in the one place Malachy could not reach. The fortress will be defended, Malachy said, returning to the practical, the only route available to him. The Blackened Crown keeps significant forces at this castle that they call home. The terrain will favour them. Yes, Cantor agreed pleasantly, as though this was the most trivial observation imaginable. Walpurgis will be of limited use in such heavy forest. He will be of sufficient use, and we will have the scales, and the witches, and all the power of the Golden Legion. Or did you forget the tally you keep? Malachy looked at his master for a long moment. You intend to destroy it entirely, he said, not a question. I intend, Cantor said, with a quiet and absolute certainty that closed the subject the way a vault door closes, to ensure that when we leave, there is nothing remaining that could be called a fortress, a garrison, an order, or a memory. He turned away from the harbour and began to walk back across the ruined square, robes trailing behind, the golden cage shuffling obediently in his wake. Draw up the debt assignments for the inland march. The captains will want to know what is expected of them. Of course, Malachy said, falling into step at the appropriate distance behind him, close enough to demonstrate attendance, far enough to preserve the distinction between advisor and subordinate. The records rustled softly at his back as he walked. And the costs incurred here, the ships, the men, the deployment of Walpurgis, add them to the ledger. They are already there, my lord, Malachy said, and if there was a faint satisfaction in his voice at this, it was too small and too well controlled for Cantor to comment. They are always already there. Cantor did not reply, and instead Malachy could hear the hard, sharp tapping of metal on stone as yet more survivors wrapped in gold, skin sheared away beneath its terrible, loathsome heat, marched snivelling and crying into the square. Without a word, Cantor began to walk, and they fell into place. Malachy just half a step behind, while the newly damned shuffled and jostled their way through their former home. Beneath their feet, the cracked stones of the square gave way to the narrower streets beyond, where the shadow of the basilica fell long and cold across the road, and the morning light did not quite reach. Malachy's records rustled in the salt-edged wind coming off the harbour, page after page of other people's death, other people's weaknesses, other people's worst moments carefully preserved and annotated for the day that they would be needed. Every page accounted for, every secret, save one.